I just want to say that I have never seen the Republican Party so unified as it is right now.
If you have a candidate that can't win 40% of the vote in the early states, if you have a candidate who can't bring in independents, if you have a candidate that is driving people out of our party.
We thought they were going to bring us back when it comes to women's reproductive choice to the 1950s. They're trying to bring us back to the 1850s.
Hello, I'm Nancy Cordes in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley is campaigning in Michigan today ahead of tomorrow's Republican primary there. She's resisting calls to drop out of the race after losing to former President Trump in the South Carolina primary on Saturday. Instead, Haley is now on a 10-day nationwide swing in the lead up to Super Tuesday, when more than a third of all GOP delegates will be up for grabs. The Republican frontrunner, Donald Trump, beat the former South Carolina governor by just over 20 points in her home state on Saturday. Robert Costa and Ed O'Keefe join us now to discuss. Robert is CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent. Ed is CBS News senior White House and political correspondent, and he is in the great state of Michigan. But, Bob, I'm going to start with you because you're right here. Haley got 40% to Trump's roughly 60%. A big gap, but not quite as big as some were expecting.
It's indicative of a division inside the Republican Party among traditional Republicans who are wary of Trump. They're going with Haley, not by a significant margin, but it's at least 30 to 40, maybe even 40 plus in some of these states. And that's why she's staying in the race. She believes there is a coalition out there for her to at least stay in through Super Tuesday.
Right. And she's making no bones about the fact that she's staying in at least until then. Ed, you actually spoke with Nikki Haley earlier today. What is she saying about the future of the Republican Party and the RNC?
Well, she's seizing on the reports today, Nancy, that the chairwoman, Ronna McDaniel, is on her way out to be replaced by the former president's daughter-in-law, one of his senior campaign advisors, Chris LaCivita. Her argument being that they shouldn't be changing leadership at the Republican National Committee during a primary, perhaps after a primary. We talked to her about that and concerns that some have that the former president will use the RNC as a legal defense fund. Take a listen. Should someone like you have a say in who the RNC picks as its new chairperson?
Well, absolutely. We should be able to.
Sounds like that you're not going to have the option, though.
We should be able to go and make sure they are non-biased as long as there is a primary. But think about it. There are resolutions now, one saying that you can't have any bias as long as there's a primary going into something like this. The other saying the RNC shouldn't be used to pay Donald Trump's legal fees.
And you support that?
It absolutely shouldn't be used. I mean, what they've said is his daughter-in-law and his campaign manager, who will now be running the RNC if Donald Trump gets his way, have said that the RNC will now be completely about Donald Trump. Forget up and down the ticket. Forget Republican Party issues. This is now a legal slush fund. He's spent over $60 million of campaign contributions on his personal court cases. At this rate, there's going to be another $100 million that he will spend. How do you defeat a Democrat, who I don't think is going to be Joe Biden? It will be someone younger. How do you defeat a Democrat when you have no money? That's the problem.
So, Nancy, that's part of the argument she's making, a little more specific and in response to some movement just in the last few days regarding a leadership change there for the Republican Party. But as Bob said earlier, 30 to 40% of the party is siding with her or against the former president. And her argument now is he's going to need that 40% to win a general election. We shouldn't have to bend to his will. He should come around to try to woo us, or Republicans should be voting for her instead.
That's a great point. And yet, Bob, you never know what percentage of people who support an opponent in a primary aren't just going to come back and support the eventual nominee when we get to November. So how worried is the Trump team really that all of these Haley voters that are taking a stand against him now won't return to the fold in the fall?
They're not that concerned. They believe that ultimately most Republican voters, even if they don't like former President Trump's conduct or his rhetoric on issues like race, that they're ultimately going to rally around him come the fall, should he be the nominee, because they don't like President Biden. The challenge for Trump is Haley and her coalition isn't the only threat to his own. He could be a felon by the time the election comes around. He's facing a criminal hush money trial in New York. It starts later in March. And if he's convicted there, maybe also faces a trial on January 6th or classified records. He'll have a lot of legal problems sitting on his shoulders politically. And that may not drive voters to Biden, but it could make them stay home. It's going to be really interesting to watch. Can Trump not only move back to the center politically in some ways, can he win over those traditional Republicans and reassure them if Haley's not the nominee, as it looks like right now?
Those legal troubles, one of the reasons that Nikki Haley is staying in the race, sort of as an insurance card. Ed, you actually spoke with Haley about why she thinks that President Biden won't be the Democratic nominee. What did she say about this?
This is something she brings up often, Nancy, so we tried to poke at this argument a little bit. Take a look. You keep making the point, too, that the president won't be the Democratic nominee. It'll be someone younger. What makes you think that?
You can look at Joe Biden now. The Democrat Party is already scrambling to figure out who's going to be the person. It is not going to be Joe Biden. And Republicans need to wake up and know you're going to be running against a younger candidate. Guaranteed, mark my words, it is not going to be Joe Biden. They are working on that now. They're trying to find out who that outfit is going to be.
Who tells you they're working on that now?
I mean, who tells you that they're not?
Well, I mean, I cover the White House and the Democratic Party, and I have seen no evidence that they're doing that other than showing up for events, interviews, running ads about abortion rights, as Gavin Newsom is doing. But it doesn't mean he's necessarily actively preparing to be the nominee.
You don't think any of the Democrat leaders are talking about the state of Joe Biden right now?
Sure, they do that.
That's my point.
So your thinking is that they'll just continue plotting ahead to get rid of him?
I mean, I think they are trying to look at what's ahead. And I think they know what's ahead is not Joe Biden for a second term. They've got to figure out what's next. Who's next?
Interesting argument, and she has a point, Nancy, about how Democrats are, getting their names out there, if only at least officially, publicly on the president's behalf right now, laying the groundwork perhaps for their own futures come 2028 or maybe sooner. Who knows?
Sure. Although, as you say, no evidence over at the White House that the current president is thinking of withdrawing his name from contention. Bob, I want to ask you about some comments that the former president made over the weekend that got a lot of negative attention, talking about his appeal to black voters. Let's take a listen to those and then talk on the other side.
The mugshot, we've all seen the mugshot. And you know who embraced it more than anybody else? The black population. It's incredible. You see black people walking around with my mugshot. They do shirts and they sell them for $19 a piece. It's pretty amazing.
You've been out on the campaign trail quite a bit. Do you see a lot of black voters wearing T-shirts with his mugshot on them?
I have not. Former President Trump's comments were called disgusting by Nikki Haley when I was following her around and speaking to her in South Carolina. And she has been highly critical of his comments. But you haven't seen Haley's refrain echoed by many congressional Republicans or Republican governors. There's not an outcry.
Why is that?
Because the Republican Party has become Trump's party in many respects. And he is the leader, even if he's not yet officially the nominee. And people are not necessarily fearful of him. They're fearful of alienating his core supporters in their respective states, who, if they take a position on him that's very tough about his racially charged rhetoric, words about black Americans that many black Americans and other Americans find offensive, that they're somehow getting out of line with the Republican position on Trump. And they believe he actually can make inroads with voters of color this year on issues like the economy and echoing his grievances. This is what Trump is saying, is that whether it's Americans who are black or Americans of other races, that because of his legal challenges, he can somehow cast himself as an outsider to the political establishment and legal establishment. This is exactly what he did in 2016. He did it again even when he was the incumbent in 2020. So this approach, this language by Trump is so unsurprising to most Republicans. Haley's outraged by it, but others are not. And that's just typical of what the GOP is today with Trump at the lead.
Yeah, I mean, you think about 10 years ago, if a Republican candidate had said, the lights are so bright, I can only see the black voters in the room, how the party would have responded.
The norms have been shattered so much. The norms being shattered on the floor is now the norm.
Yeah, no kidding. Bob Costa, thank you so much. Ed O'Keefe in Michigan, thanks to you as well. The Biden administration has harsh words for Republicans in the wake of the Alabama embryo ruling. The director of the White House Gender Policy Council joins me next. to discuss the issue. You're streaming America Decides. Stick around. Welcome back to America Decides. The Biden administration is criticizing Republicans for their reaction to the Alabama embryo ruling. In a memo, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre says, quote, Republican elected officials are shamelessly attempting to erase their own records on IVF, or in vitro fertilization. The problem is they can't. Multiple GOP lawmakers expressed support for IVF after the decision, but previously supported an anti-abortion rights bill that does not have carve-outs to protect the procedure. The director of the White House Gender Policy Council, Jennifer Klein, joins us now. That title is a mouthful, but basically it means that you are the point person at the White House when it comes to reproductive rights.
That is exactly right.
Thank you so much for being here with us, Jennifer. So is it a good thing in some ways that this ruling has prompted so many Republicans, including former President Trump, to come out and say they do support IVF?
Well, let's start by taking a step back to think about how we got here. So first of all, there is chaos in Alabama. At least 3 fertility clinics have paused their operations, including for people who are literally in the middle of undergoing in vitro fertilization. Patients are not even sure if they can remove their embryos from Alabama or whether that too would be illegal under Alabama law after this ruling. So there's chaos, but that chaos is actually created or was created when Roe versus Wade was overturned. And that, in turn, was created by the appointment of 3 Supreme Court justices who brought the majority, who was able to do that. And former President Trump has been quite clear that he's proud that he overturned Roe versus Wade. And, you know, what we've seen across the country is the devastating consequences of the loss of a fundamental constitutional right. So that started with 21 states now have extreme abortion bans, some without exception for rape and incest, many of which criminalize doctors for providing medical care. Republicans in Congress have proposed 3 national abortion bans. People are being turned away from emergency rooms. So, you know, what started as preventing people from making very personal medical decisions and taking away the right to choose is now taking away the right in a different way for people to, women and families, to make decisions to have a family, to start a family.
So when conservatives say that this decision by this group of Alabama judges has nothing to do with Roe v. Wade, you say that's not true.
It has everything to do with Roe versus Wade. If Roe versus Wade were still the law of the land, if there was still a fundamental constitutional right to make decisions about your own body, this Supreme Court could not have made the decision that it did.
So legally, does this Alabama ruling open the door for something similar in other states, or do you believe that this is a one-off?
Well, I think this decision is extreme. I also think that, you know, not just me, lots of people are looking to see what other states will do. And it does open the door to you know, what we've seen already happening, which is really extreme action being taken by states across the country.
What can the administration do to protect access to IVF?
So what we've been doing, really, again, since the Dobbs decision came down, we will continue to do, which is do whatever we can by executive action to protect access to abortion and contraception and other reproductive health.
Is there a lot you can do?
Well, you know, what we have done so far shows that there is actually a lot that we can do, not on IVF in particular, but I would say more broadly on reproductive health and rights. Things like protecting access to emergency rooms when people come to an emergency room needing an abortion as the medical care that they need in the middle of an emergency. Protecting access to contraception, which crazily seems also to be at risk. Protecting the right to travel for patients who are trying to leave a state where abortion is not legal to go to a state where they can get a legal medical service. And the Department of Justice has actually intervened in a case in Alabama exactly on that point. So those are just a few examples of what we've been able to do, what the president has been able to do by executive action. But again, he has been clear since the day the Dobbs decision came down, overturning Roe versus Wade, that the only way to actually replace the rights that were lost is to pass a federal law, pass federal legislation that would restore the protections that existed under Roe versus Wade for nearly 50 years.
Are you in communication with these clinics and hospitals in Alabama that have halted the IVF procedures for now that Alabama state officials have said they're not planning on going after people who perform IVF? Are you urging those clinics to reinstate the procedure?
You know, those clinics have to make their own decision based on the situation in Alabama. What they determine is the law in Alabama. You know, we've been reaching out to patients and healthcare providers just to express our concern and to talk to them about what they are experiencing on the ground.
So the limbo, at least in Alabama, continues. Jennifer Klein, the director of the Gender Policy Council at the White House, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to talk to you, as always.
Coming up next, we're going to bring in our political panel to analyze what CBS News exit polling from South Carolina says about the party's voters. You're streaming America Decides.
I just want to say that I have never seen the Republican Party so unified as it is right now.
Welcome back to America Decides. Well, Donald Trump says the GOP is unified, but do the results in South Carolina bear that out? And how worried should his campaign be about it? Not only did Nikki Haley win nearly 40% of the vote in the Palmetto State, but 31% of Republican voters there say they would be, quote, dissatisfied if Trump wins the nomination. Ashley Etienne and Emily Benavides join us now. Ashley is a CBS News political contributor. She previously served as communications director for Vice President Kamala Harris, and Emily previously served as the communications director for former Senator Rob Portman and as a spokesperson for Jeb Bush's 2016 presidential campaign. Welcome to both of you. So much to discuss. Let's start, though, with South Carolina, Emily, and what you make of the results there. Are there any conclusions that we can draw specifically from the fact that, once again, Donald Trump did very well with rural voters, less educated voters, but really struggled in the cities and with wealthier Republican voters?
Well, we're officially in the general election now. It's very clear that Donald Trump is going to be our nominee. And at the end of the day, Republican voters are going to come home on Election Day. They're going to see where the economy is. They're going to remember what things were like under the Trump administration. They have that nostalgia now, and they're going to come home on Election Day.
So you don't think that there is a cadre of Haley voters out there who are going to stay home if she is not the nominee?
There are also folks on the Democratic side that aren't enthusiastic. It's a bipartisan issue.
Yeah, no question that enthusiasm is a challenge, Ashley, for both sides. I want to ask you about this IVF fight that has suddenly emerged. I would imagine that Democrats welcome that debate because it is a reminder to their voters when it comes to reproductive rights that elections matter.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the battlefield that Democrats want to be playing on. They want Republicans to continue to become more and more extreme on this issue. Abortion is the issue, is the gift that keeps on giving for the Democratic Party. But I would love to take a step back here. I think what was interesting in the CBS poll, and you pointed this out at the beginning, is that there are a group, a sizable number of voters, specifically moderate voters and independent voters, that the Republican Party is bleeding consistently. We saw that in New Hampshire. We saw that this weekend in South Carolina. Those are the voters that are going to make the difference in the actual election. Now, one thing that I find very interesting is the map going forward favors Nikki Haley in a way that it doesn't Donald Trump. The first few states are much more conservative, much more red. As we move into these other Super Tuesday states, I think that's when we'll start to see the real vulnerability of Trump's real vulnerability that's facing Trump.
And yet, even in a state like Vermont, Emily, which votes on Super Tuesday, a state with lots of moderate Republicans, I think Trump is still leading her by 20 or 30 points. We just saw Americans for Prosperity, a big outside group funded by the Koch family, say, we're pulling the plug, not because we don't believe in her, but we just don't see, how more money from us is going to help at this point.
Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee this cycle. And I think that focusing on any other options is just a fantasy at this point.
And listen, we want it to be Donald Trump. Trust me.
Donald
Trump has to be on the ticket in order for President Biden to win. There has to be this threat around democracy for President Biden to win. But in addition to that, as I said before, race after race, poll after poll, Donald Trump continues to bleed these moderate and independent suburban voters. Remember, it only takes about 10% of those 30% that said they would not support, 30% of Nikki Haley voters that said they would not support Donald Trump to decide they're either going to stay home or either they're going to go with Joe Biden for us to win.
We're going to get this really interesting split screen moment on Thursday when bizarrely, both Donald Trump and Joe Biden are going to be at the border. Immigration, obviously a huge issue. Why is Joe Biden planning to go to the border now, just the second time in his presidency?
Sure. I mean, I think it's very simple. He wants to box in the Republicans in the House. I mean, there was a bipartisan deal that was on the table. It was a conservative's wish list. It was their dream bill, and they decided to walk against it and play politics. That's what the American public hates most about politics, is when our politicians decide to put their own political interests ahead of the interests of the nation. So he's going, I think, to start to sort of to box in Republicans and set the stage for a State of the Union address, where I think this is going to be a big subject. Because here's the House, the most probably feckless House in recent history. No action to protect the border, to close the border. No action to support our allies who are at war. No action to create jobs. I mean, it's every day they're writing the president's State of the Union address for him.
Did Republicans give the president a big opening on what should be one of his weakest issues?
I think that people trust that Donald Trump would be the one to solve the issues on the border. They remember that on day one,
they didn't pass like a bill like this when he was president.
And that wall fell apart, by the way.
On day one of the Biden administration, all he did was undo all of Trump's policies that were keeping our country secure and didn't replace them with anything else. What does that do? That is a huge magnet to bring folks up to the border and create the problem that we're in. It's the Biden policies that have put us in the situation that we're in, and polling keeps on showing that the American public blames Democrats and the Biden administration.
Can I just add something here?
Sure.
The Republican position on the border, their inaction to protect the border and close the border, is only going to become more untenable as we get closer and closer to the summers, because that's when the numbers start to increase. So they're going to be put under even more pressure to do something on this issue, and it's going to become clearer and clearer by the day that they refuse to do anything on it.
Is there more pressure now on
the Biden
Republicans
administration to use the tools that they already have to put in place to make our country more secure?
Right. We know that the president is considering doing something very similar to what Donald Trump did, invoking laws that would make it harder to apply for asylum. Does all of this put more pressure on House Republicans to give that bipartisan deal a second look?
The president needs to do what is in his own toolbox, use what's in his own toolbox.
But the reality is we know that the best way to address this issue is through comprehensive legislation passed by both chambers of the House and signed by the president.
Ashley-Ann, Etienne, Emily Benavides, thank you both so much. We'll have to leave it there, but appreciate it so much. And that does it for today. We're going to be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. You're streaming CBS News. Thanks for watching.